My name is Laura Bennett. I am a lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, someone who has set foot in places most people only see in war correspondence dispatches. I have been trained not to feel fear, to stand straight under pressure, to never run. But that day, standing in the middle of my father's old house in the hills of North Carolina, staring at the worn jacket hanging on a wooden peg behind the door, I could barely breathe. Not because of the grief of losing him. That grief was still there, smoldering somewhere beneath everything like a coal that hadn't gone cold. It was going to be there for a long time. I knew that. You don't lose a man like Robert Bennett and get over it in 3 weeks. No. What stopped the air in my lungs was something else entirely. Because inside the inner pocket of that jacket, my fingers touched something cold and heavy. Something that had no business being there. Something that did not belong to the quiet life of a man who grew cabbages and drank black coffee and had never, in all the years I knew him, once spoken about where he had been or what he had done. It was a gold signet ring. I held it up under the pale yellow light of the living room. It was heavy enough to feel substantial in my palm, the kind of dense old-world European gold you don't find on store shelves. Solid, deliberate, the kind of object made to last longer than the person who wore it. On its face was an intricately engraved crest, the kind of heraldic device that belongs to a family lineage, a coat of arms passed down through generations of people who understood that they came from somewhere and needed to mark it. I had seen heraldry in books and museums. I had never seen anything like this in my father's possession. And below the crest, cut deep into the metal with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 2 letters. M. My father, Robert Bennett, former Navy SEAL, a man who had spent 30 years living quietly in the mountains of North Carolina, tending his vegetable garden, drinking black coffee every morning, waking before dawn and going to bed before 9 and never once telling me a single meaningful thing about his past, had kept this ring. I remember being 12 years old, sneaking into his room to find a pair of scissors, and accidentally opening the wrong drawer. Inside was a black and white photograph. A group of young men in unmarked combat gear, squinting into whatever light was available, their faces carrying the tightness of people who were very far from anywhere safe. I didn't recognize my father immediately because his face was different, younger, yes, but also carrying something I had never seen on the man I knew. A kind of focused intensity, a compression like a spring under load. I stood there looking at it for a few seconds. Then I put the photograph back, closed the drawer, and walked out of his room without the scissors. There were things I understood I shouldn't ask about. My father never told me that in so many words. He didn't need to. He taught me by living in a certain way, by the quality of his silences, by the slight shift in the atmosphere of a room whenever certain subjects came close. I learned early that the boundary existed, and I learned to feel where it was without being told. And now he was gone. His heart had stopped at 3 in the morning, quiet as everything about him was quiet. No fuss, no last words, no dramatic farewell. Just the log house, the vegetable garden coming into its autumn harvest, the old jacket on its peg, and this ring. I sat down in his oak chair, the one he'd sit in every evening, facing the window as the hills went dark, and I held the ring for a long time without moving. Outside, dusk was settling over the low hills. The leaves had turned red and gold, the autumn colors my father always said were the most beautiful of the year. Because they're true. He had told me once when I was small and asked why he preferred fall over spring. I remember being confused by that. Spring makes promises, he said. Autumn keeps them. I sat in his chair and, for the first time in the 3 weeks since he died, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears coming down in silence. The kind that happens when you've been holding everything together so long that your body finally takes the decision out of your hands. I cried because he was gone. I cried because I had never known him well enough. I cried because this ring was telling the beginning of a story, and I had no idea how it ended, or whether I was supposed to go looking for the rest. After a while I stopped. I wiped my face. I looked at the ring one last time in the fading light. All right, I said quietly to the empty room. I'll find out. No one heard it. But I said it out loud, and that mattered somehow. I put it in the same category as the promises you make to yourself in the dark. Not declarations to the world, just the moment when you draw a line and step across it. I turned the ring over in my fingers. Belle the crest, the initials EM inside the band. engraved in letters so small I had to hold it up close to read. Fidelitas et honor. Loyalty and honor. I didn't know who EM was. But I knew one thing for certain. This ring hadn't come with my father's name on it. He had kept it for a reason. And the reason was buried somewhere in the years he never talked about. 3 weeks after burying my father, I received orders to deploy to London. In those 3 weeks I had done what you do. I notified people. I signed documents. I arranged the funeral, simple, the way his note in the kitchen drawer had asked. I found it while looking for a can opener, folded twice on a piece of paper that had been there long enough to go slightly soft at the creases. No flowers. No long speeches. Bury me next to your mother. That's enough. My mother had died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer, fast and ruthless, the way that kind always seems to be. My father never remarried. He never explained why, and I never pushed him. He just kept going, raising me, growing his garden, being present in the way he was present, which was never effusive and never absent. Now he lay beside her in the small hillside cemetery overlooking the valley, and standing before those 2 graves I felt something strange in my body. A lightning. As though something that had been pressing down had finally lifted away. Not in a terrible way. Just a change the English language doesn't have a clean word for. I had looked at the ring every night those 3 weeks. Sat at his desk, set it under the lamp, turned it slowly and tried to read what the metal might be willing to give up. The crest showed an eagle with wings spread wide above a quartered shield. Old European nobility, the kind of heraldry that gets commissioned when a family has been significant for long enough that they need a visual shorthand for who they are. The initials EM were engraved with the careful hand of someone who understood tradition, not flashy, not trying to announce itself, just the quiet confidence of an object that knows its own weight. I searched online but had nothing to go on. European heraldry runs to hundreds of thousands of registered designs. EM could be anyone. I had no thread to pull. And then the orders came. A NATO joint training program, one of the annual cooperative events that keep the alliance running at a practical level, the handshakes and shared briefings and coordinated tactics that translate political alliance into something soldiers can actually use. Under normal circumstances I would have packed my bag and treated it like what it was, professional, useful routine. But this time I packed the ring. I couldn't have told you exactly why. Maybe because it felt wrong to leave it sitting in a drawer in that empty house. Maybe because something in the back of my mind had already begun to run a calculation I wasn't consciously aware of yet. Or maybe, and I think this is closer to the truth, I had spent 8 years in the Marine Corps, and 8 years had given me a kind of peripheral vision that doesn't announce itself loudly but goes off like a quiet alarm when patterns align. There was a pattern here. A ring with European heraldry. Orders to England. A father who had never spoken about his past. I didn't know what the pattern meant. But I knew enough to not ignore it. I had joined the military partly because of him. Not entirely. I had my own reasons, my own sense of what I needed to do with my life, my own desire to test myself against something that would not accommodate sentiment. But a part of it, a meaningful part, came from growing up beside that man. Watching how he moved through the world. The economy of his motions, the weight of his attention. The way he could walk into a room and almost immediately understand what was happening in it without appearing to look. I had wanted, somewhere beneath the practical decisions, to understand him from the inside. To inhabit the same framework he inhabited and see if I could read what it meant. 8 years in, I was still working on it. I flew to London in November, carrying the ring, not yet knowing what it would find there. London in November is cold the way only London is cold. Not the dry, biting cold of the American Northeast, but something that comes at you sideways, gets into your coat, lives in the moisture of the air. The city has a quality that I noticed the first time I visited and have felt every time since. An oldness that isn't heavy or oppressive but simply vast. The sense of something that has seen so much that it can afford to be patient. London has outlasted more certainties than most places on earth will ever accumulate. This time I arrived differently than I had before. Not a young officer trying to hold herself correctly in a strange place, but someone carrying an unanswered question and waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone or something to ask her to open her hand. The training program ran its course. Tactical briefings, interoperability workshops, the careful professional diplomacy that happens when military cultures try to work together, without pretending their differences don't exist. I did my job well. I listened. I asked the right questions at the right times. I represented my unit creditably. And then, on the fourth evening, came the reception at Buckingham Palace. It wasn't my first ceremonial event. But Buckingham Palace has a quality no briefing prepares you for. The way centuries of deliberate accumulation sit in every room, the way the chandeliers make the air itself seem weighted. You feel the history not as a concept but as a physical presence, something your nervous system registers before your conscious mind can form a thought about it. I wore my dress uniform. I wore the ring. I wore it on the ring finger of my right hand, the way you carry something you don't want to leave behind, not because you've decided what it means but because it seems important not to be separated from it. A talisman in the oldest sense, not magical but significant. A reminder that there was something I needed to understand. The reception moved through its phases with the precision of something that has been practiced for generations. Then the introduction line, the formal handshakes moving down the row. I stood with my fellow officers, back straight, eyes forward, feeling the very slight self-consciousness of someone who knows that every detail of their bearing is being noticed. When my turn came, I stepped forward and stood before Queen Elizabeth II. She was smaller in person than I had expected, but her presence was exactly the size it needed to be. She had been on the throne for 70 years by then, had met presidents and prime ministers and heads of state and military commanders and poets and athletes and ordinary people, hundreds of thousands of them, maybe more. And she had looked at all of them with those eyes that didn't perform interest but genuinely saw. When she took my hand, she glanced down and stopped. I felt the moment precisely, the slight increase of pressure in her grip, the very small change in her expression, controlled, professional but real. She had been meeting people for 70 years and her face had learned not to reveal things. But this was something she had not been prepared for, and the preparation had a gap, and I could see into it. This was not surprise. This was recognition. "Lieutenant Bennett," she said, her voice composed but carrying something beneath it. "I'd like to speak with you privately after the reception." That was not a request. They led us to a small room in the West Wing. Simpler than I'd imagined, a wooden table, 4 velvet chairs, a landscape painting on the wall, the quality of furniture that has been good for so long it no longer needs to announce it. Just the Queen, myself, and an aide station near the door as still as furniture. The aide would remain there for the entire conversation and I would not hear him make a sound. She sat across from me, folded her hands on the table, and looked at me directly before she spoke. There was nothing performative about the look. She was deciding something, not about me exactly but about how to say what she was about to say. "The ring on your hand," she began. "May I see it?" I removed it and placed it on the table between us. She picked it up with the careful, practiced movement of someone who had handled a great many fragile and irreplaceable objects. Turned it, held it up to the light, looked at the crest, looked at the initials, turned it over and read, without needing to bring it close, the inscription inside the band. Then she closed her eyes for a single breath. When she opened them, something had changed in her face. The ceremony had gone out of it. What remained was something older and more personal. "Edward March," she said. "Do you know whose ring this is?" "No, Your Majesty. I found it in my father's jacket after he passed away." "And who was your father?" "Robert Bennett. He was a Navy SEAL." A silence. Long enough to have weight. She set the ring down but didn't push it back toward me. She looked toward the window, toward the dark of the garden beyond the glass, and I had the feeling she was looking at something much farther away than the garden. As though the room had become transparent and behind it was another time entirely. "Lieutenant Bennett," she said at last, "I'm going to tell you something that very few living people know. I'm telling you because I believe you have a right to hear it. And I'm asking you to understand that what I'm about to say has been kept quiet not from malice, but from the kind of necessity that circumstances sometimes force on people." She paused once more, as though making her final decision. Then she began. The year 1984. The Cold War at its most pressurized. In the world most people inhabited that year, it was music and movies and political news and the ordinary texture of peacetime life. But underneath that world, in the parallel universe that has no name on any public map, that is acknowledged to exist only years later and only partially, it was something else. Unacknowledged operations. Deaths that never reached any official record. Decisions made in windowless rooms by people whose existence was a matter of professional discretion. The intelligence agencies of the Western Alliance and the Soviet bloc were running a game with no public moves, no scoreboard, no rules that could be cited in any open forum. Human beings were the pieces in that game. And sometimes pieces were sacrificed because the game required it. Edward March was an MI6 officer, 38 years old, running a network operation in the border region between East Germany and Poland. The full details remain classified, but the shape of it is clear enough. He was supporting a web of Western assets and guiding a group of people who needed to be taken out of territory controlled by Soviet intelligence, people whose survival, if it became known, would have caused significant political damage to several parties. The operation was blown. Nobody has ever established definitively how. Counterintelligence, bad luck, a human being somewhere who made a different calculation, it doesn't matter now. What matters is that when March's group was moving toward their extraction point, they were ambushed. A prepared ambush, not a chance encounter. 4 members of the group died in the first exchange. March himself took rounds in the thigh and shoulder. He was conscious and coherent but completely unable to move independently. 2 other British officers with him were wounded less seriously. They were pinned in an abandoned agricultural warehouse nearly 2 miles from the extraction point, with enemy forces contracting around them and reinforcements coming in from 2 directions. Communications had been almost entirely severed, but their emergency signal had found its way through, and the unit that received it was an American SEAL team conducting a separate covert operation in the same general area. A shadow collaboration between the CIA and MI6 that operated outside the normal chain of authorization. Even the team's own direct superior officers didn't know the complete picture of what they were doing or why. The team sergeant was a 26-year-old named Robert Bennett. The Queen spoke steadily, 1 sentence at a time, as though reading from a document that had been inscribed on the inside of her memory rather than stored anywhere that could be physically retrieved. I didn't move, didn't take notes, didn't ask questions. I just let her words come into the room and settle. And while she spoke, I watched my father appear in my mind. Not the man I had buried 3 weeks earlier. The 67-year-old with the white hair and the weathered hands and the habit of going to bed when the light went. I saw him young, 26 years old, in the dark in Eastern Europe in November 1984, with a radio crackling a distress signal and a map that told him exactly how far the sound was coming from and exactly what terrain lay between. My father was not a movie soldier. He did not make speeches. He did not perform. The soldiers I had come to know best in 8 years of service were the ones who most resembled him, the ones who were quiet until they needed to be something else, who did the arithmetic of a situation without advertising that they were doing it, who when the moment came simply moved. No announcement, no ceremony, just the motion of a decision already made. The distress signal came in at 4 in the morning. 7 men on his team. Their mission did not technically include intervention in a British intelligence operation. They could, without violating a single order, have marked the position, relayed it up the chain, and continued with their assignment. He looked at the map. He looked at the signal. He looked at his team. "We go," he said. 2 words. That was the entire announcement of a decision that would determine whether 6 people lived or died. What happened in the 2 hours that followed is the kind of event that resists the shapes we usually use to hold such things. Not because it was cinematic, it wasn't. Combat almost never is, not the real kind. The real kind is noise and cold and confusion, and the physical weight of exhaustion and fear compressed into something your body runs on because it has no other choice. My father's team came in from the east, while the enemy was positioning for their final assault from the west and south. They reached the warehouse. What happened in between those 2 facts belongs to the dark, and the dark keeps its own counsel. What I know is that they got through the door, and they found Edward March lying in a spreading pool of his own blood, conscious enough to know where he was, unable to stand. The other surviving British officer, David Whitmore, a name I would need to remember, was wounded in the arm and had been trying to slow the bleeding from March's leg. When my father's team came through, Whitmore looked up with the expression of a man who had already accepted a particular outcome and was now being asked to revise it. "Thank God," he said, in the accent of someone educated at Oxford. "I thought we were finished." "Not yet," my father said. "Can you stand?" Whitmore could stand. March could not. The distance from that warehouse to the extraction point was close to 2 miles. The terrain was open farmland, flat, offering almost no cover, The worst possible ground for moving a man who couldn't walk under his own power. Enemy forces were closing. Reinforcements were 20 minutes away, maybe less. Carrying a casualty across that distance in those conditions was not something a tactical manual would recommend. It was the kind of problem that exists only to demonstrate what people are willing to do when they have already decided that turning back is not an available option. My father bent down. He lifted Edward March onto his shoulders. And he started moving. His team moved with him, providing cover, suppressing contacts, navigating the route. But the weight was my father's. And he carried it while the night came apart around them, while he had to drop and press himself into the earth and then rise and run and drop again, while March's blood soaked through his gear, while his lungs burned and his legs did what legs do when they have been asked to do too much and keep being asked anyway. March weighed close to 80 kilograms. The distance was close to 3 kilometers. And my father never put him down. He never told me any of this. In all the years I knew him, he never once came close to telling me. But sitting in that quiet room while the Queen spoke, I found myself remembering things I had filed away without understanding what they meant. His shoulders were never quite symmetrical. The right sat a little lower, not dramatically, just enough that if you knew to look for it, you could see it. When the cold came in or when he'd been on his feet a long time, he had a particular way of rotating that shoulder, not the gesture of someone in pain exactly, but the movement of someone managing something that had been there a long time and had become part of the landscape of his body. I asked him about it once when I was maybe 15. He said it was an old training injury. Nothing worth discussing. And his hands. I had always thought of my father's hands as a gardener's hands. Broad, calloused, capable. But the calluses were in the wrong places for a man who spent his days with soil. They were in the places where weight is transferred, where strain concentrates when a body is being used as a machine for carrying something heavier than itself. I had known for years that my father had been a SEAL. I had known his service was of the kind that doesn't get described at dinner tables. What I had not known was the specific shape of what he had done. What he had chosen once in the dark, that had left its marks on him in the only form he would ever acknowledge, the physical kind. They reached the extraction point. March survived. Emergency surgery at a field hospital in West Germany repaired what the wounds had damaged, and he lived, though not for long. Whitmore survived. One of my father's team was badly wounded but pulled through. Everyone who could be saved was saved. And my father went back to his mission as though the night had contained nothing unusual. No official report. No acknowledgement in any record that could be accessed through normal channels. The operation was classified beyond the level at which these things get documented in ways that survive. The SEAL team's involvement had never been authorized in the first place. And Cold War politics had a zero-tolerance policy for narratives that raised questions about what the American and British governments had agreed to, and what they had agreed to keep quiet. Edward March died 3 months later. The wounds had repaired, technically, but something had been opened that didn't fully close, and in the end it was the complications that took him. Before he died, he gave away his family's signet ring. 3 generations of March history, passed down with the expectation that it would be passed down again, to the man who had carried him across a dark field in November. He sent it through an informal channel with a handwritten note. The Queen told me she knew what the note said. She said it was gratitude and acknowledgement, the only form of recognition that was going to be available, and offered to the person who had earned it. My father kept the ring. And he never told anyone. How do you know all this? I asked. My voice was steady. My chest was not. Because Edward March was someone I knew well, she said. Not in the official sense. In the actual sense. Before he died, he told me everything. Not as Queen, but as a friend. He wanted someone to know. Someone who would still be here when there was nothing left to protect. A pause. She looked at the ring on the table between us. He wanted someone to remember, she said quietly. But there was more. David Whitmore, the Queen continued. The quality of her voice shifted slightly, a carefulness coming into it, the care you take when you are about to say something that is also true of a living person. Are you familiar with that name? Anyone in the American military was familiar with that name. Retired Colonel David Whitmore, the decorated hero of a daring rescue operation in 1984, author of 2 best-selling memoirs that had been on the required reading list at several senior military academies, a sought-after speaker at West Point and Sandhurst and international security conferences. A man who had built a career and a reputation and a public identity out of being the person who had done what was done on that November night. A living emblem, they called him, of what the Anglo-American alliance looked like at its best. "He's the one credited with the rescue," I said. "Yes," the Queen said, and her voice didn't judge it, just stated it. "Because of the political conditions at the time, because your father's involvement could not be officially acknowledged, because Whitmore was the figure who could accept recognition without exposing the things that needed to remain unexposed, history was written in a particular direction." Did my father know? I believe he did. And I believe he accepted it. I looked at the ring. At the inscription inside the band. Fidelitas et honor. 40 years. Not a word. I went back to the hotel and didn't sleep. I lay on the bed in the dark and let my mind go back through the years, looking for what I had missed. He hadn't been easy to be close to. Many people found him too quiet, too watchful, the way a room can feel slightly pressurized when someone is genuinely paying attention to what's in it rather than performing attention. My friends as a child had been faintly uncomfortable at my house. Not because he was unkind, but because his attention had a quality that could make people feel seen more thoroughly than they wanted to be. Once during college I brought home a boyfriend. The only time I ever did. He was studying law, bright, articulate, the kind of person who knew exactly how to occupy a room and make it feel like a favorable space. He talked with my father for 20 minutes while I made dinner. When he left, my father sat down with his coffee and said nothing for a while. I asked what he thought. He considered it. Then, he spends a lot of time talking about what he's going to do. Not much time talking about what he's done. We ended things 2 months later. Nothing my father had said exactly. Just the way I remembered that observation at the right moment, and realized it had been accurate from the first meeting. He didn't teach me through speeches. He taught through the example of how he was. He had told me once, when I asked why he didn't seem to have friends the way other people did. "I have friends. They're just not here anymore." At the time I thought he was talking about soldiers who had died, the particular kind of loss that people who serve carry without much public acknowledgement. Now I understood he was talking about something more layered than that. About the specific solitude of a person who has been through something that can't be shared. The honor buried in silence. Not humility. A wound. I decided I wasn't going to leave it alone. Not for revenge. Not because the world needed to celebrate my father. But because there is a thing that I had been trained to understand, and that he had modeled for me long before my training began. That truth is not a luxury. It is not optional. You don't compromise it for convenience, not even for the kind of convenience that looks from a certain angle like stability. Before I flew back to Washington, I read both of Whitmore's books. 8 hours in a darkened aircraft cabin while other passengers slept around me. He wrote well. The Cold War came alive in his pages, with all its atmosphere of perpetual low-level paranoia, the briefings in anonymous hotel rooms, the coded communications, the specific anxiety of operating in a world where the rules changed by the hour. He described the 1984 operation with authority and detail. In his version, he was the one who held the group together. He was the one who decided the exit route. He was the one who refused to abandon March despite his own wound. All of that was true as far as it went. But the sentence that stopped me was this. Some outside assistance, which for security reasons I cannot detail here, enabled our final movement to the extraction point. One sentence. He gave my father one sentence. Then he turned the page. I read that sentence 3 times. Put the phone down. Looked at the black nothing outside the aircraft window. Then picked the phone up and kept reading because the alternative was to sit in the dark and feel the kind of anger that doesn't accomplish anything. I was not angry at Whitmore in a simple way. What I felt was more complicated and more honest than simple anger. He was a person who had been handed a version of events by the institutions he served and had chosen to inhabit that version rather than fight it. And 40 years of living inside that version had made it, for him, something close to real. I had seen that kind of accommodation before. I understood how it happened. I didn't respect it, but I understood it. What I could not accommodate was the record. The record said my father did nothing. And the record was wrong. When I got back to Washington, I started with what I knew how to do. I filed access requests through my officer clearances, citing a research interest in Cold War Joint Special Forces coordination. Not untrue. I spent 3 weeks in the kind of rooms that exist specifically to discourage you. No windows, poor lighting, files that had been scanned once by someone who wasn't trying to make them readable, bureaucratic language so carefully opaque you had to read it backward to understand what it was actually saying. Some evenings I drove home feeling like I'd been disassembled. I ate food without tasting it. I slept poorly and woke to the same thought. A man in a field in the dark, carrying another man, because there was no other acceptable choice. He hadn't stopped, so I didn't stop. Piece by piece, the picture came into focus. 6 documents referencing an unassigned support element in the November 1984 Eastern European operation. All names redacted or encoded, but the dates and coordinates matched. A medical record for a member of this unnamed team, treated for injuries at a West German facility, that used language about the nature of those injuries that I recognize from my own training. An internal communications exchange between CIA and MI6 referencing unanticipated SEAL support that had ensured the success of the extraction. And then one document that I read 3 times before I trusted myself. An internal commendation proposal, never formalized, never forwarded up the chain, drafted by a CIA officer whose name had been redacted, recommending recognition for Sergeant R. Bennett, Naval Special Unit, for actions of outstanding valor in the operation of November 1984, to include the sustained transport of a critically wounded principal across open hostile terrain under continuous enemy contact. The recommendation was denied. Reason given: cannot acknowledge participation of U.S. personnel in an operation of this classification. I sat with that for a long time. Someone had sat down and written those words knowing exactly what they meant, knowing that on the other side of the denial was a specific human being who had done something specific, something remarkable, something that the institutional machinery was prepared to let vanish into the archive because acknowledging it was inconvenient. I closed the folder. I drove home. I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee I didn't need and thought about who my father had been and what he had deserved. David Whitmore was in his 80s and living outside Charlottesville, Virginia. I had found this in the feature interview run to mark the Cold War anniversary. He sounded sharp in the piece. Settled into his reputation in the way that people do when the reputation has had enough time to become synonymous with who they are. I didn't call. I drove. A quiet street. A trimmed garden. A white fence. His name in clean letters on the mailbox. The exterior of a life with nothing to conceal. He answered on my second ring. Still tall, age having curved the top of him slightly but not undone the posture beneath it. The posture of someone who had stood at attention too many times in their life for it to ever fully leave. He looked at me with a measurement in his gaze that told me he was still someone's intelligence officer in the habits of his attention, even in his own doorway. Mr. Whitmore. I'm Laura Bennett, Robert Bennett's daughter. The pause that followed was longer than a pause needs to be when the name means nothing. Come in, he said. The living room of a man who had spent his life in history. Bookshelves from floor to ceiling. Framed maps on the walls. Photographs. I let my eyes move across them quickly. Whitmore with presidents, Whitmore at podiums, Whitmore in dress uniform with the medals arranged above his pocket. The biography of a public figure laid out in images. I didn't hate him for it. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to describe him as a villain and that would be dishonest. He was a man who had been given a story to inhabit, and he had inhabited it. Perhaps more fully than he had intended when it began, perhaps in ways he had learned not to examine too carefully. That happens to people. That is a human thing. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it comprehensible. We sat without ceremony. No offer of tea. No small talk. He looked at me directly and I looked at him, and the room held the particular silence of 2 people who both know that the conversation that's coming is the real one. My father died last month, I said. I know. I saw it. He'd been watching. Of course he had. I found Edward March's ring in his jacket. I met Queen Elizabeth in London. She told me about November 1984. Whitmore looked down at his hands. Old hands, the knuckles enlarged with time, the hands of someone who had done things and carried things and held on. When he looked back up, I saw in his face what he had been keeping out of it for a very long time. Your father, he said slowly, was the bravest man I have ever known. In my entire life. And I have known some brave men. I know that now, I said. A moment passed. Outside, a bird was singing somewhere. An absurd, ordinary, impervious sound. I was not the hero of that story, he said. His voice was flat, not with suppression but with the tone of someone stating a fact they have had 40 years to make their peace with, or perhaps to fail to make their peace with, I couldn't tell which. I was the man who could be credited. The narrative needed a face, and my face was available, and your father's wasn't, not because he was less deserving, but because his involvement was the kind that two governments had agreed, without ever writing it down, to pretend had not occurred. He knew. He knew. We met once a few months after. Informally, off every record. I didn't know exactly what I wanted. To apologize. To explain. To make it mean something other than what it meant. He paused. He listened to me and then he said something. I've never forgotten it. What did he say? Whitmore looked up. And for the first time since I had walked through his door, his face opened slightly, as though something that had been load-bearing for a long time had been at last set down. He said, "Live well. That's enough." And then he left. I sat with that in the car before I drove away. The Virginia light in late afternoon going orange and violet at the horizon, the low hills holding the color the way hills do when the sun is almost gone. Live well. That's enough. That was my father. That was the man I had grown up beside and not fully understood until now. The man who had done something extraordinary, and then walked back out into an ordinary life, and tended it with the same steady attention he had given to the extraordinary thing. No bitterness. No performance of modesty. Just a clear-eyed assessment that the thing that needed doing had been done, and that the doing was its own complete transaction. I was not him. And I did not believe that living well and staying silent were the same instruction. Whitmore gave me the box. He had kept it for 40 years under his bed. That specific detail stayed with me, the image of a man sleeping every night with a box of evidence beneath him that could have changed the record, but that he had chosen to keep where no one would ask for it. The box contained his personal diary from the period, medical documentation, unofficial correspondence, and a letter handwritten by Edward March in the weeks before he died, that described in unambiguous terms what Robert Bennett had done on the night of November 14, 1984. "I should have brought this out years ago," he said as he handed it to me. "Why didn't you?" A long breath. "Because I was afraid. My story was my life. I didn't know who I would be without it." A pause. "And because your father asked me not to. He said the people who needed to live had lived and that was what mattered. That was enough." He looked at me steadily. "He was a better man than I am." "He was," I said. "But he's gone. And now I decide. 6 months of formal process. 6 months is a long time to fight for something that cannot fight for itself. I worked with a military attorney, a Pentagon historian who specialized in declassification, and a contact at MI6 who had been introduced through a diplomatic channel that the Queen had activated on my behalf. There were review boards. There were documents. There were people who asked with genuine puzzlement why this mattered after so long. My answer never changed. Because truth does not expire. There were concerns about Whitmore's legacy. Concerns about diplomatic sensitivities. One official asked whether I was sure this was worth what it would cost. "My father is gone," I said. "The record remains. And the record says he did nothing when the truth is that he saved 6 lives. That is not a minor discrepancy. The records were verified. Both governments acknowledged the truth. Whitmore kept his honors, no one rewrote his entire history, but the official record was amended formally to include what had actually happened and who had actually done it. And a ceremony was held. A clear Washington winter morning, the kind where cold air makes the sky so sharp you can see the individual branches of bare trees against it. I drove to the ceremony hall with the metal case on the passenger seat and didn't turn on the radio. The hall was small by request. A few dozen people. No press. No speeches longer than what the moment actually required. Just the people who belonged there. Whitmore came. I hadn't invited him and hadn't barred him. He sat in the back row in a plain dark suit without a single medal on his chest. When our eyes met before the ceremony began, he gave me a nod. I returned it. 2 people who had come to understand something about each other, and about the man who had been the reason for both of them being in the room. I stood straight in my dress uniform beside an empty chair. On the chair was a photograph of my father from his service years, younger than I am now, looking directly into the camera with the expression of someone who was entirely present. No performance, just attention. The general read the citation. I heard every word. For actions of outstanding valor in the operation of November 14, 1984, Sergeant Robert James Bennett willingly risked his life to preserve the lives of 6 personnel, including critical Allied intelligence assets, under conditions of extreme hostility and disadvantage. His courage, determination, and complete disregard for his own safety directly ensured the success of the operation and preserved those who could not have been preserved by any other means. I held my posture. I straight ahead. The way he taught me. Not because he said so, but because I had watched him do it my entire childhood and understood that this was what you did when the moment asked it of you. When the general placed the medal case in my hands and I looked down at my father's name printed on the citation cover, Robert James Bennett, clear and correct and finally in the right place, I raised my hand in salute. Not ceremony. Not procedure. Just the only thing available to me in that moment that was adequate to what I felt. 2 days later I drove back to North Carolina. The house was as I'd left it. Locked, the garden gone to winter. The air inside carrying the particular smell of a place that has been closed since someone lived in it. I didn't turn on the lights immediately. I stood in the dim living room and let the space come back to me slowly, the way you have to let your eyes adjust. His chair was still facing the window. I opened the medal case, looked at the silver medal for a moment in the light coming through the glass. Then I closed it. I reached into my pocket and took out the ring, Edward March's ring, the ring that had been the beginning of everything, and I placed it on the table beside my father's old coffee cup. The cup was still there from the morning he died. A neighbor had found him, had called the people who needed to be called, and at some point in that morning the cup had been left where it was, with the faint ring of dried coffee inside it, and no one had moved it. The gold ring beside the stained cup. 2 small objects. One belonging to a man who had been remembered for 40 years. One belonging to a man who was only now being properly named. I sat in his chair and looked out at the garden. Cabbages still showing green against the dead leaves. They hold against the cold, he used to say. The light low and long, casting the shadows of late autumn across the ground. I thought about what the Queen had said before we parted. A man like your father understood something that takes many people a lifetime to learn. That the worth of an action doesn't come from whether it's witnessed. It comes from the action itself. I had asked her whether recognition mattered. She had been quiet for a moment. Recognition matters, she said finally. But not for the person who acted. For everyone else. So that we know such things are possible. So that we know what people are capable of. My father had not needed recognition. He had lived with what he'd done in the way that certain people live with things, carrying it quietly, not as a burden but as a fact, one of the facts of who he was. He had not needed anyone to confirm that the night of November 14, 1984, had been worth it. He had already made that decision. What I had done was not something for him. It was something for the record. For the person in a windowless room 20 years from now, reading a file, who would see the name Robert James Bennett and know that he existed, chose, acted. That such a choice was made by such a person, not for recognition, not for reward, but because no other choice was consistent with who he was. I stayed 3 days. I cleared the garden, cleaned the kitchen, went through his things, not much because he was not a man who accumulated. Practical books, a well-organized toolbox, clothes folded with the precision of a person for whom neatness was not compulsion but habit, and in the last drawer of his bedside table, a small wooden box. Inside, photographs from his service years, men I didn't know in places I couldn't identify, a section of old map, folded to the point of fragility, his dog tags, and a piece of paper in his handwriting brief. The good ones lived. That's enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it several times. That was him. All the way to the end, still him. Not regret. Not bitterness. Not the performance of acceptance, which is the thing people do when they haven't actually accepted anything. Just a clear statement of what he believed, that the people who needed to survive had survived, and that was sufficient reason for everything. I put the note back. Left the box in the drawer. Some things belong where they are. My last night there I sat on the back step looking up at the sky. In the mountains of North Carolina, far enough from the nearest city, the winter stars have a depth to them that I always forget until I'm back underneath them. The third step was worn smoother than the others, the mark of years of habit, of a man who had sat in this exact place enough times to leave his shape in the wood. I drank black coffee. I let myself remember him not as a mystery to be solved or a wrong to be righted, but as my father, the man who taught me to tie my shoes at 7, who stood beside me for 4 hours the first time I drove a car and said nothing except more gas, and ease the wheel, who drove 12 hours straight to Annapolis when I graduated officer training and shook my hand and said, "Well done," in a voice that contained every version of pride he would never have described out loud. The man who never bragged and never apologized and always showed up. Quietly. Completely. Without theater. He said once when I was about 14 and had asked him something about courage, "Some things matter more when you do them. Some things matter more when you say them. The trick is knowing which is which." I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. Before I left, I wrote his name and the date on a small card, November 14, 1984, and tucked it inside the metal case beside the silver medal. I called Mrs. Miller next door. She'd been the one who found him that morning. She cried a little when I thanked her. She said he was the finest man she had ever known. Quiet, she said. Kind, she said. Always brought vegetables to her gate at harvest without being asked, without saying anything about it, just left them there. He never needed a thank you, she told me. He just did it. Like it was obvious. That was him, I said. Driving away, I looked back once in the mirror. The log house in the gray morning light. The bear garden. The frosted roof. There are many people in this world who live entire lives doing things that never find their way into any record. Not because the things were small, because the circumstances of history are indifferent to individual human worth, and sometimes the cost of naming something correctly is higher than the people who control the naming are willing to pay. My father was one of those people. He had chosen not to fight for his own acknowledgement, and that choice was his, and it came from the same place as every other worthy thing he ever did. He had decided that the lives of the people he saved were the only receipt he needed. I don't believe he was wrong to decide that. I think that decision came from a place of genuine greatness. But the record matters. Not for him. For the record itself. For the accuracy of the thing that outlasts all of us and tells the generations after us what kind of people we were. And for the young soldier in a windowless room, 20 years from now, who needs to know that such choices are possible, that people make them, that human beings, under the worst conditions, are sometimes exactly as good as we need them to be. My name is Laura Bennett. I am the daughter of Robert Bennett, who carried a stranger on his shoulders for 3 kilometers through open hostile terrain in the dark, and never told anyone. He didn't need to be famous. He didn't need to be remembered. But he deserved to be. And now he is. This story ends here. But another one begins. The story of everyone who does the right thing in the dark, without audience, without expectation of credit. The story of people who understand that honor is not a performance but a practice. Not the accumulation of recognition, but the accumulation of decisions, each small and each real. My father lived that way. He is what I am trying to become. Fidelitas et honor. Loyalty and honor. Those 2 words had been on the ring all along. They had traveled in my father's jacket pocket through 40 years of quiet, patient, unacknowledged life. And now they were on the table beside his coffee cup in the house where he had lived, in the hills where he had chosen to be, in the light of a winter morning coming through the same window he had looked out of 1,000 times. The ring of the unnamed hero, beside the cup of the man who had never asked to be named. My name is Laura Bennett. And this story belongs to my father.